Bonjour, buongiorno, hola, привет, and hello. My name is Anna Cartwright, and I'm here to talk to you today about building listening skills through authentic resources. Let me give you a little bit of background on my personal journey and my personal experiences with using authentic resources in my French classroom. So I am a French teacher at Orchard Park High School. Orchard Park High School is located in Orchard Park, New York, just outside of the city of Buffalo. It is the suburb where the Buffalo Bills play. So if you're wondering where you've heard that name before, it might be from there. I've been teaching French here since about 2008, with a short hiatus in between when I went to a different district, but then returned. In 2015, I began teaching in the AP program here at Orchard Park. I took over the AP French class for a teacher who was retiring. And my first set of students in AP really threw me for a loop. When we sat down to start practicing listening tasks for the AP exam, they panicked and they got very nervous. And there was a tremendous amount of anxiety in my classroom about listening and about taking listening tests, doing listening exercises, or just plain listening to French sources in general. And this worried me because by the time students get to AP, we typically expect that they're more comfortable with listening to the language. So discovering that my students had this much anxiety led me on a little bit of a journey to start figuring out how I could incorporate more authentic resources into my lower level classes, because I also taught at the time French 1 and French 2. So I was looking for ways to incorporate listening in French 1 and French 2 so that by the time students got to their AP French program a few years later, they would be more comfortable and have some experience working with listening activities. So before we begin talking about these listening activities that I've been working with, let's talk a little bit about goals for listening. If we take a look at the different proficiency levels from ACTFL, and we look at listening comprehension as part of the interpretive mode, we see that at the novice level, students need to be able to recognize isolated words when they hear them, recognize high-frequency phrases when they hear them, comprehend a phrase at a time, be able to hear things multiple times before they comprehend things, and understand some sentence-length speech in some contexts. Contextualized support is usually recommended for this level. So these are kind of the guidelines for where my French 1 students need to be by the end of the year. My French 2 students need to be somewhere between novice high and intermediate mid. So while they still need to be able to recognize the isolated words, the high frequency phrases like they did when they were in French 1, they're also building in some comprehension of sentence-length speech. They may not understand full texts altogether, but they may be able to have some comprehension of main ideas when topics are familiar. My AP students, you'll notice they need to be somewhere between intermediate mid and advanced low. So they need to start exhibiting some confidence and some ease in their ability to understand things, which is definitely where my AP students were not when I took over the program in 2015. You'll notice that nowhere in here does it say that students need to be able to understand everything that's happening in a task. So I started talking to my students to get an idea of what was causing problems for them when it came to listening, and what was making them nervous, what was making them panicky, what was leading to their anxiety. Here are some things I came up with. The first issue my students were facing was what I like to refer to as speed shock. And I'm sure you've all heard this before. When you play an authentic source for students and they go, oh my gosh, they talk so fast. How am I supposed to understand them when they're talking this fast? That's speed shock. In my AP students in 2015, speed shock was overcoming some of them to the point where the speed of the text was causing them to panic so much that they were shutting down and they were unable to comprehend words, phrases, things that they were definitely familiar with and should have been able to pick out of a text. I have found over the years that the more students listen to authentic sources, the more exposure they have to this native type speed, the more comfortable they get with the speed as it's going by, and the more able they are to delve into a passage and not just get so wrapped up in the speed that they don't hear what's going on. Some of my students expressed fear and anxiety. They didn't like the timing of an authentic source. Okay? They didn't like the fact that they couldn't, because our intermediate or our novice and early intermediate students can comprehend a phrase at a time. When you string a bunch of phrases together, even the more comprehensible phrases start to lose their comprehensibility just because the student doesn't have time to process one phrase before the native speaker moves on to the next. Some of my students were getting distracted when they were trying to listen. They knew that they needed to listen for main ideas. They knew they needed to listen for details. They knew they needed to listen for complications, and they didn't know what to listen to first. And so it all became so overwhelming that they kind of just couldn't listen to any of it. There is the lack of knowledge of linguistic structures. So sometimes a student would hear a word or a phrase that was brand new to them. They didn't understand what it meant at all, and they would kind of latch onto their panic of not understanding one thing and miss the next thing that was being said. There was a lack of understanding of the context of the text. When it came to the context, sometimes words and vocabulary will change based on which country somebody from a speaker from a different country is speaking. Some words get used one way in one country and a different way in a different country. And without knowing where a source came from, some of them were being a little lazy and not reading the little context blurb before the speaker began. Without understanding that context, they were misinterpreting things they were hearing and then getting confused and then shutting down. And some students would just hear an accent that they were unfamiliar with, and it would throw them for a loop. Many of them were used to listening to my voice or the voices of other teachers who were working with them, and we had all been trained in France. And then a source would come on from Canada, and the Canadian accent's a little bit different, and they would get wrapped up in noticing the accent differences, and they would stop hearing the text itself. So with all these barriers to listening comprehension, how can we help these students overcome barriers to begin understanding what they're hearing? What I came up with is that students need to listen to authentic sources multiple times, but they need different goals in different areas. Listening isn't really one skill. It's kind of an umbrella skill with a bunch of different little skills within that umbrella that students have to master in order to be able to start comprehending the big picture. So my idea became, if I could chunk the skills a student needed to understand a text, we could listen with a different goal each time in order to get students to the goal at the end of the text of feeling comfortable with the text enough to begin answering some comprehension questions about it. And so that year, with those AP students, I came up with this idea of layered listening. I like to say that this is where the middle school teacher in me met the senior teacher in me. I went back to some of my middle school resources that I had from when I had taught middle school in a different district. And one of the foldable things that we had was this, it's called a flippy, I'm not sure. But you have 2 sheets of paper, right? I have 2 sheets of printer paper, offset a little bit, and then folded up. And they create this little booklet, but with different pages of different lengths in here. So I started doing some activities where my students were doing what I called layered listening. They were peeling back the different layers of the text to get to a more precise understanding of what was going on. So when I developed this activity for my AP students, I started off with layer 1, emphasizing the importance of context. Okay? So I gave them the context that they would typically see in an AP exercise at the beginning of the activity, the introduction that they would need to read. And I would also give them some key vocabulary that they may or may not have known, but that I thought would be helpful with the text. Okay. As a class, I would tell them we're going to trust the process, and we're not going to open up our packet until we're ready to move on to the next step. So we'd start off with reading the introduction together, talking about vocabulary that might be difficult to understand at that level, talking about what it means, making predictions about what kinds of things may be discussed in the text. When we were able to finish that layer, students would open to the next layer. And this was where I was having students do a first listen with some note-taking. I've given them a space to take notes, things they heard, jot down words, phrases, etc. And then over here it says, après l'audition du texte, qu'est-ce que vous avez compris? Écrivez un petit résumé. So after listening to the text, what did you understand? Write a short summary. So we would listen to the text once, they'd take a few notes, they'd try to summarize it in a phrase or 2. After we were finished with that layer, we'd move on to some comprehension questions. So we would listen a second time, and then afterwards we would try to answer the questions to see how well we could answer these questions that looked at things like main ideas and a couple of the bigger details in there. After that, I had students go to a more precision listening. So here I actually gave them the text of what was being said, but I've pulled out some words and I've turned it into a close activity. I've discovered that doing this close activity was critical in building my students' confidence with listening skills. All of the words I pulled out are words that are easily understandable to them. Many of them are simple words that they saw at the level 1, level 2, when they were in their novice and early intermediate years, that they've used repeatedly over the years. I've pulled these words out, and now they've got to listen specifically for that blank. Showing my students that they could hear familiar words in the text gave them the confidence that they needed to start being more comfortable hearing words they know in other texts, whether or not we were doing a close activity. So that year, when I encountered my panic students, I started using these layered listening activities. And I was discussing them with some other teachers a few years later, and they asked me, well, did you incorporate this activity in the same way into your French 2 classes? And I had to sheepishly admit, I hadn't even thought about using them in my French 2 classes. But what a great idea. To have students in the lower level listen, like deep listen, through a passage to start developing their understanding of what they're hearing. So I've modified the activity, and this is how I use it now in my level 2 classes. So I have a different text here that students listen to. And in the last activity, they were listening to an MP3 file that came off of a radio station. Here, they're actually listening to a YouTube video. So when I use this in French 2, the first time the students listen to the text, I turn the screen off, the projector off, so they can't actually see the video. They just listen. And I ask them to make a list of any words they heard at all. Okay? So you'll notice I'm not asking them to identify a main idea or to do any deeper thinking. I'm just asking them to listen for whatever they can grab from it. So students make their list of words, and then after that first listen, I ask them to share what they've heard, and I record their words on the board. So we make a class list together of everything we heard. Then we look at the class list and we try to hypothesize, what could this video be about? The students come up with some theories. Then I show it to them again. Okay? And when they listen to it again, then on the second listen, I ask them to add to their vocab list. And a lot of times they're able to add to this list a whole bunch of words that either they saw in the video, because sometimes words appear on the screen in a resource, or words that they gleaned because they were able to see a picture and hear the word for the picture at the same time. So we add to the list, then we go back and look at our hypotheses, and we try to figure out which ones were correct. Then we go on to the next page. So this is our next first listen when we're looking for the main ideas of the video. So you notice I have a series of big idea questions. For level 2, I've kept the questions in English, and they're pretty basic. What kind of holidays is this video about? What are the different categories of the holidays that are mentioned? So again, not looking for the details they talk about, but a sort of big picture detail of the categories, because the video kind of was divided into sections, and then a question about intended audience. After that, I have a layer where we do some bigger picture listening. We look at some perspectives in the video, and this sort of ties in some of the questions that we see in the IPAs that we do for reading, where students are asked to make hypotheses, answer questions about culture, etc. But then that last page, I go back to a close activity. But you notice this close activity does not look like the close activity I put in front of my AP students. I like to call this a modified close. So instead of giving students the entire text of the video, I pull out key phrases from the video, and I've given my students a word bank that they can use to pull different expressions from. So the students get a chance. I usually let them read through the questions first, or read through the sentences first. If there are words in the sentence that look confusing to them or that they've never seen before, we can define some of them. They look at all the words in the word bank, and then we watch the video 2 more times, and I have them fill in the missing words in the sentence. And again, this gets them listening for the very details, for the word level, and has them identifying words and phrases. This activity has been proven to be very successful with my level 2 students. A lot of them have said that they start off listening, that first listen to the video, being very panicked about the topic of the video. But that by the time that we've finished all of the multiple listens on each page of the layered listening activity, they feel very comfortable with that text, and they feel like they've really understood something in French. So this serves first to build their skills, but also to build their confidence. Then COVID came along, and we were suddenly teaching online. I've discovered that this layered listening activity works really well in a Google form. In a Google form, you can actually separate sections and require questions. So the students have to answer questions on a page before moving on to the next page. So separating the form out into these different sections has proven to be very helpful, because that section break sort of functions as the page flip on the paper version. So you'll see this is the same activity we were looking at on the last slide, except now it's virtual. And I put this version of it in my Google Classroom for students who weren't physically present in class to do it on paper. They can do it online if they were absent or ill, or had to miss class for some reason. So that first page, they have to make a list of the words that they have understood while listening to the video. I give these students a goal, if they're not in the classroom, to try to get at least 10 words or phrases on their list, because they don't have the advantage, if they're not in class, of partaking in that discussion that we have when we're processing the first couple of listens as a group. On the second layer, I've got questions about the main idea. On the third layer, I've got my close activity. This is where I put it for these lessons. I did it as a drop down because there's not really an option for word bank in Google Classroom, but the drop down list is all of the words that were in the word bank, and they see the same list each time. And I usually leave a note to them somewhere that says each word will be used once, so they can eliminate it if they choose to work that way. And then on the fourth page, that's where I put the perspectives about the video, where they can do some long answering about some of the details and the culture actually involved in the video. Now, layered listening is great, but I found it works best if I devote 30 to 40 minutes to it in a period. And I don't always have 30 to 40 minutes to incorporate authentic resources on a regular basis. So sometimes I separate out the activities and I do them independently rather than walking through all the steps, so we can practice different skills on different days. For instance, when my students are learning about weather, I will show them a weather report from France, and we'll do that listening for vocab activity that we do at the beginning of the layered listening activity, where I ask students to listen for any words they understood. We make a list on the board. A lot of times I do this activity at the very beginning of French 2, because that's when we're reviewing weather expressions. And at the end, when we look at that list and we look at all the words that the whole class has contributed, I say to them, wow, look at how much you got. You started listening to that and all you could think was, oh my gosh, he's so fast when he's talking. But then you really did start to hear some of these weather expressions in there. There's a lot of French you do understand. I think that cheerleading piece is critical for our students when they're working with authentic documents, because authentic documents are scary. They can cause panic. And if our students aren't starting to breathe a sigh of relief that they're starting to understand something, then they run the risk of building anxiety. And that's not what we want to do with our students when they're faced with an authentic document. Sometimes we do modified close activities in isolation in class. Here's one I created for my French 1 students for the end of the year when they're working on their nutrition and health unit. You'll see here that I have the sentences with the words pulled out and a word bank at the top. If you read really closely into these sentences and you know something about soda or pop and you know how unhealthy it is, you probably could answer these. You could probably do this close with this word bank without even watching the video. So occasionally when I've used a modified closed, I've used it in a quick conjunction with a listen for the words type of deal. So I'll play the video first before I'll hand out the activity. We may share out words we heard in common, we may not, depending on the group of students I had in front of me. Then I'll share the activity with the students. I'll give them a few minutes to read over the questions and maybe guess at a few matches if they can. And then we'll listen again. And that second listen is when they're expected to complete the close. I found that listening first and putting the activity in front of them second sometimes tricks them into listening harder, because they don't realize right away that they could probably answer these without the video in front of them. My modified closes for level 2 get a little bit more tricky. And now if you look at these activities, you notice like there's more than one number I've pulled out. There's more than one plural word that's pulled out. So the questions get a little trickier, and now you have to start listening for the answers. I still use a ton of cloze activities in AP French. When we do our initial listens in my AP French classes, I will make them listen without the cloze in front of them. And then I'll start asking them, instead of asking them to identify words or phrases they'll heard, I'll ask them to share out what they thought the text was about. If they can't do that, we might move backwards to, what do you remember? Anything you heard at all during the text. And then sometimes ease into the what was the text about. But a lot of times after one out of context listen, kids have enough information from it to say, oh, that was about sharks, which this text is. Text is about how in 2015 selfies killed more people than sharks did. It's kind of an interesting text. They always like it. Talks about people trying to get selfies in dangerous situations. And having accidents and dying, and how more people died that way than by shark bites in 2015. Okay. Pre-reading questions is a strategy I like to make sure my students are comfortable with. So you may remember me talking at the very beginning of the video about how students get distracted when they're listening, and they know they have to listen for certain things, but they don't know what to listen for first. Creating a listening routine and coaching your students through what types of things they should listen to on the first listen and what sort of things they should listen to on subsequent listens can help eliminate the panic of not knowing what to listen to first. And because my lower level students, when they do listening on their final exams at the end of the year, they listen and they answer multiple choice questions, I like to try to do some activities that coaches students through the importance of reading the question before you listen, just to get an idea of what you're listening for. So in the past, I've given students a video, and before I put the video on, I will put up the questions, and I'll have them read it, or if it's on a sheet of paper for them, I'll have them read and underline words they're not sure what they mean, so we can talk briefly about those before we do the listening activity. In AP French, sometimes I'll give them questions and I'll white out the answers. I have found the amount of time that students have for reading questions before they listen to a task on that specific exam, it's helpful if students don't read the answers and they just read the questions. Because if they read the answers, sometimes answers are so close that it might throw them for a loop, and they might hear one answer in the text, but it's not the right answer to that question. So it's better to focus on what precisely they need to listen for rather than what the possible options are, because then you can uncover the answers and they can take what they heard and now try to reason through what the answers are. So I've done this kind of activity with students on paper for a long time. Then COVID came along, so I modified what I was doing a little bit. Instead of giving the questions on paper to my students beforehand, sometimes I will just show the students the questions ahead of time on the overhead projector, have them read, have them ask questions. And then we'll listen to the video and answer the questions in Edpuzzle. Now, I love Edpuzzle. Edpuzzle can be used so nicely with our authentic videos that we use in class. It's a great way of keeping track of who understood what. A lot of times I give students credit for doing the activity, not necessarily for how well they scored, but I go back and look at how well they scored on the activity so I can get an idea of who's a weaker listener and who's a stronger listener. And if you're a French teacher and you've never heard of these Une Minute de Bon Goût videos, these are amazing. Brussels was named the gastronomic capital of Belgium in 2012, and they made this 26 video series. Each video is 1 minute long, and it focuses on an important food in Belgium, specifically in Brussels. Like you'll notice this one are des frites, French fries, and they're in the iconic Belgian frite cone that they serve them in. as the guy whose head is always shaped like the food is talking, off to the side, key words and phrases that he's saying pop up on the screen. So the students have the benefit of the visual of the food, but also the visual of some words that give them some additional context while they're listening to authentic French. I like to use multiple listens when we're working with music. I know many of you work with music in the classroom, doing Mani Musicale or the March Madness brackets with the music and different songs. Sometimes I like to have students listen to music, specifically hearing out a grammar point that we may be working on in class. For instance, this great song by Grégoire, it's a little bit old, but it's still a good song, Toi plus moi. It's filled with stress pronouns. So a lot of times I'll have students, when we are working with stress pronouns, listen the first time through with their eyes closed and just raise their hand when they hear a stress pronoun in the song. That's a quick way for me to check to see that they're hearing the grammar in context that we're working with. And then afterwards, I give them the paper with the lyrics on it, and we can do a cloze type activity with the song. I also have created this game to play with students. We don't do it very often, but I like to use music bingo to show students a grammar point that we're working with and show them how it gets used in a bunch of different sources at once. So this particular version of the game that you're seeing, this is designed for AP French, and it focuses on the subjunctive. Okay, so here is the grid. We're playing 4x4 bingo. Here are the phrases that we're listening for. I have students copy a phrase into each box. I ask them to do it randomly. I tell them if they do it in order, they definitely won't win because this is just alphabetical. So they fill in the phrases randomly in the boxes. And then I begin to play short clips, not full clips, but short clips of songs. And you'll notice that in this little song clip, I have a cloze with one word missing. The bingo board is their word bank. So they're listening for that one phrase out of that song that's in the word bank. And of course, all of these in the word bank are different examples of subjunctive. Okay, so they find it, and we move on to the next one. Then we move on to the next one. I always tell them that, I'll give a prize, usually a sticker, to the winner of like the game, the person who gets the first bingo. But then after that, we play through all the songs so that they get exposure to everything. So where can you find authentic resources to use in your classroom? You might be saying, I don't know where to begin to look. Well, there are a bunch of different places on the internet where people have curated authentic resources for language teacher. Leslie Gran has an amazing website where she's put together some curations for all kinds of different languages, all different kinds of things. There are groups on Facebook. For instance, I'm a member of French Teachers in the US. There are groups on Facebook where teachers share out things that they found. There are boards on Pinterest that you can join where teachers share out authentic resources that they've found. If you're a French teacher, the AATF, under the guidance of Catherine Ousselin, they've put together both Pinterest boards and Wakelet pages where they gather together tons of authentic resources, and they're all organized by context, which is amazing. And then in my state, New York State is actually working on creating an authentic resources Wakelet for all of the languages that we teach in New York State. That's a great place to shop around too, even if you're not from New York. But going beyond curation into the wild of authentic resources, if you will, think about your culture triangle. When we're bringing culture into our classroom, we're examining the relationship between products, practices, and perspectives. We're seeing how products influence the perspectives of people in target cultures. We're looking at how practices influence the perspectives of people in target cultures. We're looking at how perspectives of people in target cultures affect the products they choose and the practices they use. Practices and products are a great place to start brainstorming places to find authentic resources. Let me give you some examples. For products, think of brands. Think of, brands you encountered when you studied abroad or traveled abroad in the target culture, and start looking them up on all the socials. Look them up on Instagram, look them up on YouTube, look them up on Twitter. All of these places will put you in contact with that product. And a lot of times, if you're finding one specific to the target culture you're working with, they'll put you in contact with authentic resources. Stores. Think about the stores you shopped in when you traveled or studied abroad. A lot of times stores have YouTube pages with commercials on them, or they have neat little tweets, or there'll be interesting images on Instagram or videos that they share on TikTok, etc. Agencies, like the agency that organizes train travel in your target culture, or the agency that organizes the post office in your target culture. A lot of times these will have social media pages filled with authentic resources. The one you see here on this page, this is the train company in Switzerland. You'll notice they've got videos in English, but they've also got them in German, they've got them in French, and I believe there may also be some in Italian on this page. Think of TV and radio stations. If you start following them, in addition to the social media, you can also start following them in a podcatcher. So something like Apple Podcasts or Stitcher, or even, what's the other one? Spotify. Spotify has podcasts, believe it or not. And some of TV and radio stations in target cultures will have podcasts that they launch pulled from either their TV shows or from their radio shows that you can download and play for your students. When it comes to practices, think about following sports teams in social media. Sports teams will post little videos, they'll post interviews with players. All of these can be used as authentic resources. And then when it comes to practices, think of children's TV, especially TV geared to the very young. Children's TV shows, especially for the lower levels, are great. First of all, because they talk a little bit slower, because the native speakers they're seeking to target don't comprehend their own language as fast as an adult speaker would. So it is still a native speed, but a native speed intended for a child instead of an adult is going to look a little bit different. Kids' TV shows also tend to try to explain target culture practices to members of the target culture, because these children are learning the practices as part of learning their own culture. For instance, there's a great video called Petit Ours Brun, La Galette des Rois. So this little video, it gives an example of Petit Ours Brun and his experience with La Galette des Rois, and or the king's cake, and he's looking for the fève, the little bean inside. He's hoping to be the king, but he doesn't get it, and he's kind of disappointed. But you see the whole practice of cutting up the galette de roi, the king cake, and serving it. You see Petit Ours Brun goes under the table to tell the different people who's getting which piece, just like they do in the target culture. This is something that target culture children are going to identify with and say, oh yeah, we do that at my house. And this is something that your students can look at and go, oh, so that's what the teacher was talking about. It's like a perfect illustration of the activity. It also can illustrate practices that people do in their regular daily lives that our students might not have a ton of example of. For instance, down here we have Simon le Lapin and his video called On va dormir dans le train. That's something that not a ton of American students have done. So it can make for some interesting cultural conversations afterwards in class. If you're a French teacher and you haven't heard of the Un jour, une question videos, these are amazing. These are geared towards elementary students, and they explain different elements of culture, of government, politics, etc. to students. They also explain current events and different things that are going on in the world, which are a fascinating way and an easy way to share target culture with students. Everything's well explained and illustrated, which also makes any of these cartoons really, they're great for movie talks. So if you isolate different images from the video, you can do a comprehensible input style movie talk activity in which you talk about what's going on in the video, and then afterwards you can play the authentic video and students enter to that part with a greater understanding of what's going on, and they can hear the target language and be a little bit more comfortable because they're not grasping for trying to identify every little detail of what's happening. Now they can kind of hear the target language for what it is, which is excellent. I highly recommend setting up your feeds on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, TikTok to incorporate some of the different brands and teams that you hear, because sometimes the authentic resource will find you if you do that. Just the other day, a video popped up in my YouTube feed. It was a commercial about La Fête de Saint-Jean-Baptiste, which is coming up in Quebec, and which is something I teach about in my holiday unit. It was a Tim Hortons commercial, but because I was following Tim Hortons en français, it popped right up. I was able to save it so that when I come to that unit next year in school, I'll be able to show that advertisement to them. Here's a little background about where I got some of my materials from. I want to thank you for taking the time to take part in this virtual summit and continue your professional learning over the summer. And I want to thank you for choosing my video and clicking on me to hear more about authentic resources. My name is Anna Cartwright. You can reach me at acartwright@opschools.org if you have any questions. And in the files attached for this video, I've also shared a template for layered listening, where I've kind of figured out the page measurements in order to get, when you photocopy it, that flippable appearance. And then I've also shared the slides from this presentation in case you want to look back. Some of the slides do have clickable links in them that you should be able to click on if you are interested in seeing a specific resource or a specific video in more depth. So thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. Grazie, gracias, and diakuyo.